In the videos I've made for RWBY over the past 3 or so years, I've spoken much about the story, animation, and design of the series. With Volume 6 and the aspects of RWBY's design that I've started to learn more about, one area I've neglected to properly dive into are the visuals of the series, specifically the special and visual effects of RWBY. It has always been there as a part of the show's presentation since the color trailers, and although it was more primitive and limited, largely due to what resources the RWBY had, it has since evolved quite a bit over the years, with Volume 6 proving to be no exception. Despite acquiring a better understanding about the process, yet not a complete understanding, I do still find some issues for what is ultimately presented in Volume 6, which I'll briefly go over by the end of the video. Now, before I get into the special effects for RWBY and how they've evolved and been implemented in each volume, I want to make this perfectly clear. I am not very knowledgeable in effects and other aspects of animation, as well as animation production. I'm going to try to convey this information as best and as clearly as I can. I might make some guesses and assumptions to help fill in the gaps of information I either don't have or couldn't fully understand. If you are versed in the fields of effects animation and visual effects, especially if it pertains to RWBY, please feel free to correct me and add onto the knowledge I present going forward. What I said in the Volume 6 animation video is that I was surprised to see so much 2D animation for the special effects of Volume 6. After taking the time to look into how the effects were accomplished in all the previous volumes, I found out that 2D effects and other such visual assets have been used in RWBY from its conception. During the early volumes and the color trailers, most effects were made in After Effects and Flash, with additional effects being taken from a particle effects library called Particle Illusion. Monty and Shane Newville would be credited for the special effects of Volumes 1 and 2. Even so, some artists on the RWBY would provide additional VFX, like Patrick Rodriguez and Carrie Shawcross.
Sometimes that happens where I'll need something from her and we just put it right on the. I mean, 3D is great like that, where if you take an image and put it on something, it'll still be that image.
And that happens with almost every artist on this panel. Like Patrick will need, like, oh, we do need the chibi stuff for RWBY, so we'll just have him draw it. Or Christina is like, oh, we need this awesome matte painting in the background. Let's just have her draw it, and I'll just composite it in. There is some buzzing. According
to the behind-the-scenes videos for Volume 2, effects were mostly implemented in Poser. One of the ways they would do this is with cards. A card is essentially a 2D plane that plays the 2D effects animation in the 3D scene. This would be implemented into scenes mostly for slashes, impacts, and scrapes. Cards have also been used for characters moving quickly past the camera and can be seen with Blake, Oblek, and the Beowulfs in Episode 10 of Volume 2. Cards are continued to be used to this day, with the most recent example I've been able to confirm being found in Sun's fights with Ilya in Volume 5, Episode 10.
So today I'm going to be talking about my process of how I did the Sun vs. Ilya gunchuck sequence. From here, once I'm happy with the two characters, I start adding 2D effects cards into my scene. So like that hit right there is just a flat plane with a animated card going across it. And we have the final asset for Ilya's weapon in here. There's more effects. I also added some, you could see right here, the bullet casings from Sun's gunchucks.
Of course, actual 3D effects are used during the early volumes for fire and 3D objects. Neo-blocking Yane's projectile in Volume 2 is a fluid simulation. Bursts of debris and rubble are physics simulations, mainly using minor explosions to influence the physics. One physics simulation in Volume 2, done by Shane, is the tables being reassembled by Glinda after the food fight. What he did is roll a giant spheres through all the tables, bowling ball style, and had then technical director Jeff Young handle the reversal of the simulated animation. One 3D effect I'm surprised to learn is a 3D effect is the milk squirting from the milk carton when RWBY crushes it. Apparently, Monty did this by running a bunch of spheres through what he refers to as the formers.
This took a while. There's a milk carton that's very fun to do. That milk spilling out was just like a bunch of spheres that I just had run through the formers.
I have no idea what he means by the formers. I assume transformers, but again, I have no clue. For Volume 3, a lot of what they did is a continuation of what they had done before. One visual effect that did get a significant change from Volume 2 to 3 is reflective surfaces. During episode 7 of Volume 2, the dance floor is shown to act as a mirror of the environment, but did not reflect the characters dancing. In Volume 3, Episode 6, the character models are still not reflected, but the way the environment looks in the reflection is way different. What's the difference? What changed? Simply put, they faked the reflections in Volume 2 by copying the environment, flipping it upside down, and placed it underneath the floor. They would do this for characters facing other common surfaces that reflect light, like glass. In Volume 3, they actually made the surface of the floor reflective and thus properly reflected the set on the floor. A not noticeable aspect of the environment missing in reflection are the flames on the wall candles. The light of the flames are reflected, but not the flames themselves. This would suggest that these were added in during the compositing stage of production. By the end of Volume 3, the scene that had the most effects passes would be the fight between Cinder and Ozpin. It is clear to see why with all the flame and crystallization effects for Cinder's powers that blend 2D and 3D, and Ozpin's blend of duplicates and bubble shield that do the same and might even have some 2.5D stuff. All of it really well done and still holds up. For the first 3 volumes, animation was done in Poser, but it wasn't the only 3D software in use, such as Maya. From the beginning, the RWBY have been using Maya to model and rig their 3D assets. Then, using the UV maps of the models, have the models textured and colored through Photoshop. The completed models would then be exported into Poser for animation and rendering.
Our assets have to go through this pipeline of concept, modeling, texturing, and then finally being able to be put in the 3D program. So we start out with the concept, and we usually bring that image into Maya, which is the main 3D software we use. We have to make a 3D model that looks exactly like the concept we were given, and it's quite a process. Basically, we're pushing polys and extruding stuff until we make the perfect shape, and then afterwards we have to UV unwrap it, and they lay everything out on a texture sheet and then paint it, and that will put the image on the model. After that, we're basically done with the modeling and texturing, and then we have to give it to the animators. So then we will set it up in Poser so the animators can grab it and use it for their characters.
Right now I'm working on the Velvet model. We get a concept for the character, so most of it's already there for us. We just have to translate that into 3D, but it's a 2D image, so when we bring that into 3D, we have to make sure that from every angle that character comes through. Now that I've laid out all the polygons onto a flat surface, I am coloring those polygons in Photoshop. This screen here shows like all the polygons laid out flat and organized into a square texture, because each one of those polygons on the flat surface represents a polygon on the 3D model. That way I can just paint on them in a flat image, and that'll transfer over to the 3D model, and it'll take all the color information from that texture, that flat texture, and show it on the 3D model.
Volume 3 would also see the use of new tools and software through newcomer and freelance YouTube animator Dylan Gu. Dylan would use the 3D modeling and animation software Blender to create effects and bring them into Poser for his animation on RWBY.
Dylan, did you have to make a bunch of new effects to work with these elements in this fight scene?
Yeah, I did. There's a lot of particle effects that you'll see, like this one, for example, where I kind of, I made it in Blender and then put it into Poser. Just to get that custom kind of biome feel. It really makes you feel like the biome's actually being affected by what they do.
Volumes 4 and 5 marked a big shift in the web series visuals. Instead of having scenes and characters implemented and animated in Poser, they fully changed to Maya and started using 3ds Max. With this change, Maya would become not just the modeling and rigging platform, but also the main animation software. The reasons why they decided to do the full change to Maya is because the software is more commonly used and referred to as an industry standard at the time. Maya is also more scalable, allowing them to conduct a bigger production, and that they were hitting the limits of Poser, as Poser for Volume 3 was crashing more frequently due to bigger sets that included more and more polygons than the previous volumes. 3ds Max would be used to shade and give the characters their anime aesthetic with a plugin known as Pencil, a tool they saw used for the 3D scenes of the TV series Black Rock Shooter. The RWBY first tried to use a tool they made themselves to emulate Pencil in Maya for the Volume 4 character short that it focused on RWBY, When it came time to go into full production on Volume 4, they opted to get the pencil tool for 3ds Max instead of trying to imitate it through Maya. Another noteworthy addition to Volume 4 is a dedicated special and VFX team. This said team would be able to build both 3D and 2D effects that would be implemented into the scenes and during compositing. They would also be able to R&D these effects and tools. For example, the lightning effects by the Sea Dragon Grimm during Episode 3 actually have rigged bolt effects and randomizers placed with seeds. These seeds would be used to get a consistent output of the electric blasts. The ocean in this episode is also a large model rigged with controls for speed and direction, as well as the peaks and valleys of the waves. This team did try to do some R&D for the fire effects at the bandit camp, but it was never finished and was even planned to have a particle system driving it.
The torches were a big part of an almost practically unfinished bit of R&D between our seasons. I wanted to work up a fire look that was more traditional anime style, but to actually use a particle system to drive it.
Okay.
And I got this sort of, hey, this is about halfway there. This is kind of starting to work. And then we ran out of R&D time, and it was like, and then I was like, how many torches are we going to have this season? And how close are we going to get to them? And it just kept, that answer kept changing. And it was like, okay, well, hopefully it'll hold up.
Yep, for what it's worth, I think they look really nice.
Oh, thank you.
Volume 5 would continue to experiment with 3D and implement 2D effects. The way the 2D effects look seemed like a predecessor for what we would see in Volume 6. Especially when looking at the effects used for the clash between Cinder and Raven. Speaking of which, Zane Teaser, lead compositor for Volume 5, created the effect for the Maiden Eyes in After Effects. His implementation of this effect, via his own plugin, made it so the effect didn't have to be placed onto a character's eyes and be tracked by hand.
We'll give a shout to Zane too, he's our lead compositor. He made this crazy complicated but easy to use After Effects. He essentially made his own plugin for doing those Maiden Eyes.
Oh wow!
That makes it super easy. It's still a lot of work, but it is so much easier than hand tracking them in. I don't want to downplay that they have to go in and still massage it, but I mean, like he really got into a really good system, which allowed us to do it for the whole fight in 13. Like without that, we probably would just flash the eyes here and there, but we thought it would be aesthetically a lot cooler, but also be a little bit better representation to actually have them on the whole time, and he made it work.
Zane, do you want to talk about those Maiden Eyes?
Sure. I love this sequence. One of my favorite and hilarious comments that I read regularly is, with regard to the Maiden Eyes, is, the Maya engine looks so great. While the Maya engine does do a lot of wonderful things for animation, the Maiden Eyes are not the Maya engine. Yeah. That's all comp.
That's all in compositing. That was awesome.
Volume 5 would also see attempts to create 3D effects that try to emulate the anime style. For example, the airship colliding and exploding into one of the floating islands is multiple different 3D effects layered into one. You have the physics simulations for the crash and explosion manipulating the debris, then there's the 3D smoke trail and explosion given some form of toon shading through the use of plugins that they have for Maya. Finally, there's the dust particles generated by Maya.
The ship will hit the big cliff and pieces will fly off. And what's really cool is we can select these individual pieces, and then what we'll do is emit dust off all of those. So the individual pieces will have dust kind of flying off them, so you get this really good trailing dust kind of look that goes onto it.
All of this would then be layered, composited, manipulated, and rendered to get the final look seen in Episode 2. The envelope had definitely been pushed year after year with RWBY's visual presentation, and the 2D and 3D effects are just a small part of it. There are 3 other factors that contribute to making RWBY transition from looking like a work in progress to a completed product, which you've heard me mention 2 of these throughout the video already: compositing, layering, and lighting. Regardless of what effects are added to each shot of a given episode, these 3 aspects of RWBY's production are important to help realize the desired visuals of the series. This term had been mentioned a few times already, but to formally explain, the compositing stage, or comp for short, involves taking all the individual elements of a shot and manipulate them to get a completed shot that will then be placed in the edit. Compositing is typically used to manipulate each element of a given shot to achieve a desired look. This includes moving and recoloring already placed elements and adding in new elements to then do the same. This can also involve cleaning up shots and tracing out or rotoscoping undesired clipping.
We would have a character sit in a new way, like Sun on a rail.
and not just totally fucking break.
Well, the thing is like the animator, in the past, the animator would get to it and go, I can't stop the bottom of his shirt from clipping through the rail. I can't. I don't have the control for it. So we'd go, okay, I guess we're going to fix it in post or not do that pose. And now
and we were the compers who had to fix it at the
exactly,
time.
Yeah.
When a shot is ready to work on, we take the renders from lighting and we have a setup script, and it's constantly being changed and modified. So we create a template for every scene that has sort of like a look that's pre-built into it. And from there we go in and we do our color correction, we do our depth passes, we make it look like a finished shot. We have to do a lot of cleanup, we have to do a lot of tracing out, which we call rotoscoping, traveling mats, and yeah, I don't know, it gets pretty complex.
Effects can be created and implemented during the compositing stage of production. An example of this in action is the anime crying effects placed on RWBY and Weiss in episode 2 of Volume 2. Carey is the one who actually accomplished this, back when he and others on the team wore more than one hat during production, but I found little on how he was able to do so. From the commentaries of Volume 2, the tears are actually textured onto the character models, and Carey animated them during comp. You can actually see the non-animated texture on Weiss for a moment. Layering is actually done before compositing and is integral to make it all work. Layering basically requires placing each asset on a particular layer or its own layer. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, I initially thought the same and believed that RWBY would have each asset be a part of a certain layer, like environment, character, background, foreground, but the layering process is actually a lot more complex than that. Yes, each element is in a layer, but there can be a whole tree of them. Essentially, for RWBY, there can be 50 layers or even more than a whopping 100 layers found in a given shot. A single character model alone can have around 25 layers.
We use Adobe After Effects for compositing, and this is a fairly typical shot, a little more complicated than some of the simpler shots. And you can see we've got almost 30 layers active in the shot. But if I was to go into the character herself, let's look at Weiss in this example. This is a fairly typical setup for the character herself. We boost the whites of their eyes, like that, and then let's see, here's the line layer, a little easier to see like that, and finally the glints in her eyes, which are these little tinier dots, and then you add all those together and you get Weiss. So when you're looking at the top level, you're seeing 25 different comp layers, but considering each of the character layers, each of their weapons is another 8 to 10 layers. Really, you're looking at the potential for hundreds of layers in a typical RWBY shot.
The compositing team will then take all of that and manipulate each element in a given shot that are now in their own individual layers. The character silhouettes back in Volume 1, blurring a character's model, depth of field, all of those have been done during compositing thanks to layering.
A lot of the times the effects are done through compositing. That's the only time I'll open After Effects is like, I'll export this as the base, this because I knew Yang's hair would glow, and then put them together in After Effects as a pin layer with some blur, and you've got an effect. And maybe just the same for when she got later in her fight, base layer, hair layer, some effects exported from like a simple particle program, merged together, and you have the glowing effect. Same thing for like these explosions, which are actually just cards with pictures of the explosions on them. And I export those all separately. That's Particle Illusion, by the way, which has a beautiful library of pre-made effects that you can just choose from. Putting that all together, it looks like that. And that's really all you need. There's even some like texture error going on right here, or it looks like his pants exploded.
Then there's lighting, which is interesting to look through in RWBY's case, as for Volumes 1 and most of 2, the scenes and characters were flatly lit. The shadows or shading on the character models were also textured in and not a result of light and shadow from a light source in the environment.
Blake as well. You know, it's very simple, and if you can tell here, the shadows are baked right on. Like that's the shadow from her scarf to her neck. That's the shadow from her tailcoat to her skin. You know, everything for Blake is pretty much right there.
Volume 2 is where we would start to see cast shadows from the characters, but these shadows would not be cast onto the actual character models, mainly the environment. Sometimes shadows would just be 2D images at the base of a character's feet. Volume 4 is where we would see them actually have light and shadow affect the character models and not just the environment. Like with the visual effects, a whole team was introduced for the task. What Volume 4 brought to the table is called zone lighting. Volume 4 would have 2 light and shadow zones for each character. Some scenes at night would have a third zone for highlights, also known as edge lighting. This would go into full effect for Volume 5, which also introduced a 4th zone for color, which they used to fake in comp. Despite the change, lighting was actually pretty weird on a case-by-case basis for the first 4 volumes of RWBY. Volumes 2 and 3, for instance, had characters and their weapons be given different lighting. I mentioned this in a previous video on Volume 4, there are some scenes that would also have the characters given a different set of lighting when compared to the environment. I actually found out why this happened. The environments themselves have been lit in Maya using the physical rendering plugin Redshift, and the characters were lit in 3ds Max along with the previously mentioned plugin Pencil. They would get better at matching the lighting between the characters and environments from Volume 5 onward. One interesting detail about the lighting after the change to Maya and 3ds Max is how they have a light source in the scene that comes directly from the camera. This is to achieve what can be best referred to as beauty lighting. The goal is to remove ugly, distracting shadows from the characters' faces and bodies. Why would this be important? Take a look at YouTube movie reviewer Jeremy John's old videos and compare how much better he looks with good lighting in his current videos. After hearing all of this, one of you might want to point out the scene with Ironwood and Torchwick at the end of Volume 2 as an example of them using light and shadow like with Volume 4. Actually, this is a clever trick in which a semi-transparent box was placed in the scene that Roman would move in and out of.
It has to be perfect.
Yeah. Oh, also, he remembered one of my old tricks here. Like that shadow over Torchwick's face is actually just a partly transparent box, which gives the impression that he's sitting in shadows. Because we don't actually have lighting for the characters, so he just is penetrating a box that's partly transparent. That's a trick I told him, like when Austin did, like literally the first season with Ozpin and RWBY last year when he walks into the room through that door. It's a good thing he remembers this stuff.
Another one of you might bring up the scene of Blake and Yane in Volume 2 as well. This was done during comp by messing with the colors of the scene with maybe some overlays. One that I want to bring up is the God Rays in the scene between Weiss and Winter for Volume 3. At first I thought the Crewbie placed extended triangular objects or cards that were given some transparency and attached them to the character's environment. But then I saw this. My mind was blown at that point. I couldn't think of how they placed these God Rays in and somehow have them deform with the character's eyes. Until I remembered a video from gaming YouTuber Smitty in which this happened.
Beautiful.
Plums.
Oh my lord. Did you say plums?
So I think they got the God Rays in through After Effects during the compositing stage of this scene. Not 100%, it's just my best guess. To end this section off, let's show a shot from RWBY Volume 8, Episode 12 that exemplifies these 3 aspects of RWBY's production. This finally brings me to Volume 6, where they hired on 2D effects animators like Mike Chapman, who previously worked on several seasons of the FX TV animated spy series Archer at Floyd County Productions. The RWBY Effects team would build an effects library in After Effects. Alongside After Effects is a procedural 3D software called Houdini, which would help drive crowds for Volume 6 and replace Gollum from Volume 5 that did the same. It is stated that Houdini was used for some effects, which the website for it shows that it is absolutely capable of, but none were ever specified or explicitly stated to be done with Houdini outside of crowds and the mention of shaders. After Effects would be used for the compositing stage of production, while Maya and 3ds Max would continue to be used the same way they were for Volumes 4 and 5. New to Volume 6 is the use of nulls. These are essentially empty objects that are placed in a scene to act as placeholders for effects and tell the effects animators and compositors where to place the effects and other assets. These would be used a lot for muzzle flares. One set of assets that you would think these would be used for are the footprints in the snow during episode 2. But these were actually tracked and implemented by hand.
I definitely am so happy that we got all the footprints in too. I feel like that added so much.
It does.
It, grand scheme of things, y'all got it down to a science so that it wasn't that huge of a thing.
If people knew how we put those footprints in, they'd be like, really? Like,
well, now I want to know.
Well, we're just placing it in the After Effects in the 3D world space.
We tried, I think, a bunch of
with
different
no nulls.
Oh my god.
What?
Yeah. So she's eyeing every foot.
Yeah.
Every foot placement.
That's crazy.
We talked about it.
Pre-placed nulls probably would have been good to use here. Episode 3 had hundreds upon hundreds of different effects, with the final render having over 500 of them in total. These included 3D fluid simulations for the blue smoke and Salem rising out of the pool of destruction, and multiple 2D and 2.5D effects made in and composited with After Effects. My favorite being the effects for Salem falling into the pool of creation, which were created by Mike Chapman and then implemented in comp by Heather Rogers. The wave being frozen by Weiss in episode 11 is confirmed to have been worked on by the camera, animation, assets, and post-effects teams. Camera would first need to set up the shot, animation would then create the 2D animation for the wave, assets then takes up the task to create a frozen 3D model of the wave that matches its peak. Finally, post-effects would create the transition between the two that was most likely done during compositing with After Effects. Now, in my previous animation video, I mentioned how there are 3D effects being used in Volume 6. Some I have already covered, like the previous one, which is a combination of 2D and 3D. So let's actually get into some of the 3D effects for Volume 6. There are some obvious ones like the rock and ice pillars during the last couple of episodes. I don't actually have any information regarding these, but I feel I have researched enough to accurately guess how they were created. These pillars would have been modeled and rigged with controls that would have sliders for transitions between the different stages of the asset. Same thing could have been done for the crater that was created after Yang countered Adam. There are 3D effects that are even given to specific characters, like Jin's smoke skirt that I mentioned in the previous design video. What they did is create a transparent cone from her waist on down, roughen its surface, and have the smoke emanate from her waist and react to the transparent cone. The last time something like this was done is with the smoke effects inside the Sphere Grimm's orb, which was made as a part of the Grimm's model and simulated for about 600 frames or around 25 seconds, which may actually be quite long to simulate for. The last 3D effect I'm going to talk about is the water fluid simulation of the Leviathan rising out of the ocean. Lead VFX artist Ryan Bowden and VFX artist Sean Cunningham were the ones who handled the sim, and lead compositor Penelope Nederlander was the one who composited the Leviathan and the water simulation into the scene. Yep, the ocean of this scene is a separate element, and Penelope did a great job blending the water sim and the Leviathan into it. The VFX team actually started research and development for this water sim so early that they didn't have the animation for the Leviathan before they started, which worked to their benefit as it made implementing the Leviathan and its animation with the water sim smoother. By the way, I recently learned that water simulations are basically particle simulations through the Corridor Crew's VFX Artists React series.
When you're doing water simulations, you're basically doing a particle simulation. So in CG, they basically created a box and they filled it with particles. And each one of these particles has a parameter with how they're going to influence the particles around them. How much do they stick? How much do they not stick? And the way that all flows and works together, you can kind of like smooth it out and you get water. Now, the thing is, if you have too few particles, your water looks really globby and chunky and you almost end up seeing the actual particles. And of course, in real life, water does kind of turn into particles in the air, but they're very, very tiny. But if you look at all the ripples and all the waves and all that detail, that means that the particles being used for this water simulation are so tiny and there's so much of it, it's insane. It's insane. The amount of processing power needed to do that shot is just incredible.
Unfortunately, I don't know if the water sim done in RWBY was simulated in Maya or Houdini, and if the described way water sims work by the Corridor crew fully applies to every water simulation in RWBY. The scenes the lighting team had to take a lot of time dialing in was the underground waterway for the Brunswick farm in episode 6. The challenge the team had was to have the environment look dark with a creepy feel to it and have the characters feel part of that darkness while also making sure everything is still readable for the viewer. Let's end this section off with a criticism for the 2D special effects overall for Volume 6. After looking into them for some time after the animation video, I find that they need to work on blending these 2D effects with the 3D scenes. The effects can come off as flat and lack depth. This isn't a problem all the time, but there are times where it is apparent that the effects are flat. This can apply to Volume 7 as well. Speaking of, might as well throw this in here, I don't like that Yang's semblance effect is her hair actually turning into fire rather than have the fire radiate from her hair. It may not have been done well in Volume 6, but it was at least consistent with how it was presented in the series prior. It may not have the same implementation, but it still gives off the same idea. If I had to throw some pros in for how they are now handling the special and VFX, I would say that the effects are more streamlined and consistent. Over the years, the crew VFX artists and technicians have been trying to develop tools and techniques to simplify and match the aesthetic goals of the series. What they've done here is all for the purpose of achieving that goal. And looking at Volumes 7 and 8, they are still tweaking, still pushing themselves and their visuals further and further. So that ends my coverage of the special and visual effects for RWBY as a series. There are obviously a lot of effects I either skimmed over or didn't even mention. I wanted to get into them, but I just couldn't find any information on them, like the aura effects from Volume 3 on. Since I couldn't find concrete information on them, I couldn't include them. Instead of finishing this video off with a summation and concluding statements, I want to talk about the approach I took for these last two videos. Truly, these are an experiment more than anything, and are something I may not do again. What I wanted to do is try to go over the actual design process and intentions of RWBY. Why? Well, I just got really interested in these details this time around due to the animation changes and other design details that I learned about while watching Volume 6, as well as other things I came across after the volume had ended. Since I didn't see many other people talking about RWBY in this way, I decided to give it a shot. Inspiration for how I approached this mainly came from the YouTube channel Good Bad Flicks. This channel has a video series called Exploring, in which the person running the channel covers the conception, staff, production, marketing, release, and post-release of a given film or franchise, and then will give their own opinions about the topic being covered. If you have the time, check out the videos exploring Mortal Kombat and The Mask. Before officially ending this video, I again want to thank Hypeathon, who helped me research and also provided feedback on the script for this video. You were a big help. Since this video is different from my usual, the questions I pose to you will also be different. Now, was there ever anything you noticed a change in RWBY's design and production? How did you see that change impact the series? Has any aspect of RWBY's design and production ever piqued your interest enough to make you want to look into it? Did something like that ever happen to you for a piece of media outside of RWBY? If so, what did you discover and what was your takeaway from it? Please feel free to post this information in the comments below.